Hello and welcome to our Syxsense February Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after that. And with that, Rob Brown.
Thanks, Johanna. I really appreciate that. And a very warm welcome to the February Patch Tuesday webinar. If you're here in the UK, it's obviously a very special month for us because we have the Rugby Six Nations, and for everybody else, today happens to be a very special day as well. With that, we do appreciate you joining us, and we're going to talk about the Patch Tuesday and some news, and we're going to talk about some very important things that have helped us to support our customers in deploying over 1 million updates every single month over the last 20 years, accumulating in over 200 million updates to keep our environment, our customers safe. Now, with that, we're going to talk about some news. Now, we covered this last month, and I had a lot of questions from a lot of customers and viewers of the webinar regarding end of life for the Microsoft operating system. Some of these are coming up very, very soon. In fact, for Windows 10 Enterprise, you'll be potentially really surprised that it actually is going end of life next year on the 14th of October. But let's just go back to Windows Server 2008. It did go end of life this year. If you're still using that legacy operating system, unfortunately, there are no more updates available. If you're using Windows 2012, you can purchase an ESU extended license for the next 3 years. That will actually expire in October 2026. If you are a Syxsense customer and you purchase an ESU license for your Windows Server 2012, that is all you have to do. You just simply activate the server, and from that moment onwards, Syxsense will be able to scan for updates that are available, and you'll be able to deploy them. I just mentioned Windows 10 Enterprise is going end of life next year. It's right around the corner. So if you're planning to do so, I would highly recommend you look at the roadmap for Windows 11. Now, Windows 11 current feature update is 23H2, and that is going end of life in 2026. However, 22H2, which is been around for about 30 months, will actually no longer receive optional or preview updates at the end of this month. So after this month, there will no longer be optional updates for drivers and optional software, and no longer preview updates, which kind of shows you that Microsoft is gearing towards the end of life for the service for that particular feature update. Now, everything I've mentioned doesn't include the long-term servicing branches for those operating systems. So if you do have Windows 10 or Windows 11 long-term service branch, then you will actually have an extension till 2030, I do believe. So you have an awful lot of time left to keep your systems patched. Now, I'm going to give you an update on the preview updates because there's been something very interesting happening over the last 4 or 5 months. Now, Microsoft has obviously their own test team. So when there is a patch, a cumulative update, the test team is the initial testers of those updates for testing compatibility with the patch to make sure that it doesn't cause any end user disruption to their customers. Now, since October and November last year, or in October and November last year, we didn't get any preview updates. And it's the first time that I can ever remember 2 consecutive months where a preview update was not released by Microsoft. Now, you might ask, why is that important? And the reason it's important is because not only is Microsoft testing internally, but providing those updates to customers who use the preview edition of those updates, allow them to expand the testing to their partners. Now, when we didn't have November and December available preview updates, it meant that our customers should do additional testing because it hasn't had the sheer volume of testing of those particular updates. And so if you were with us in November and December and January, we talked about the additional testing that you might want to perform to validate the cumulative updates to your own environment. A couple of things, such as if you have laptops, make sure you install the updates on laptops. If you have desktops, make sure you install them on desktops. Don't just rely on the virtual devices to validate the safety of or the compatibility of those updates in your environment. Do make sure you cover all your bases. Now, what's interesting is that in January, we had a restart of the preview updates. And for the very first time, the KB that was used for one of those preview updates was here in February, meaning that it hasn't had any changes to it. They've simply taken a preview update from January, renamed it to cumulative update in February, and they've released it. That's the first time we've ever seen it. But I would still use the additional precautions that we've been recommending since November last year. Do some extra testing. Just make sure that you can both install and uninstall the updates. And using Syxsense, you can do that very, very easily. We also had an announcement yesterday from Caesar. Caesar did release an interesting update, which I found quite interesting for a different reason. Adobe has released these security updates this week. Caesar is saying that a cyber threat actor could exploit some of these vulnerabilities to take control of an affected system. We call that weaponization. Now, they're encouraging users of Adobe to update the necessary updates. And of course, we have Adobe Acrobat and Reader, which is probably on every single system, especially everyone that is watching this webcast. What is interesting is that when you go to the Adobe website and look at the priority that they've allocated to these updates, they've given it a priority 3. And now if you go to the Adobe website and look at the priority 3, it says install sometime within the next usual monthly cadence. That doesn't exactly say that this is urgent, because Caesar does say that this could be exploitable. So I'm going to recommend that this be installed within the next 1 to 2 weeks, just to make sure if Caesar is aware of something that is happening, that you prioritize those updates. Don't wait for a full monthly cadence. Go ahead and deploy Acrobat or Reader updates. If you have any other of these updates software in your environment, do make sure that they've got auto update turned on, and make sure if any of these do require reboots, that those reboots are performed to fully resolve the vulnerability there. Now, Patch Tuesday, we've had a return to the usual number of Microsoft updates. They usually in February are between 50 and 100. We have 72 fixes in the last release, 5 critical, 65 important. There were some moderates as well. We had 8 which are more likely to be weaponized. 2 are in fact weaponized, and we're going to talk about what weaponized means in just a second. 0 are public aware, which is interesting because usually weaponized goes with public aware, but we had 12 jump points. Now, jump points is a very special type of vulnerability, and it is also known as a scope. When a vulnerability, if a vulnerability is exploited, a jump point means that you can exploit the initial technology, the initial vulnerability, and then move sideways. So in this example, if you were to exploit the browser, you could jump to the operating system. Similarly, if it was a hypervisor, you could exploit the guest and jump to the host. We have not seen as many jump points in a single Patch Tuesday release for almost a whole year. There has been 12 jump points, and if you are familiar with the way we upload our recommendations to our website, we do list every single update that has a jump point. Please go down that list and make sure if there are any applications that you are using and depending on for your business that has a jump point, maybe add that into the priority of your rollout. Now, we are aware a lot of customers have a very distributed environment, potentially across the world. So we might not be able to deploy everything, but it's the priority of the first deployment that really matters the most. Jump points may be part of your priority to keep your environment safe. Now, what we call second tier is the type of bug that's fixed. This could be the second decision you make about what is prioritized for the first rollout. Now, we have quite a lot of bugs that are fixed. Excuse me. Remote code execution vulnerability is a class of cyber attack in which attackers execute commands or place malware or malicious code on your computer or network. The most serious usually. We have almost twice as many as the next vulnerability in the list, with 30 fixes in total. It's quite a lot. Followed by elevation of privilege vulnerability. That's where a threat actor gains access to an employee account, bypasses proper authorization channels, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. So kind of data loss. It is the second, and usually these two are usually 1 and 2 in every Patch Tuesday. But we also have quite a lot of spoofing vulnerabilities. That's an act of disguising a communication or identity. It's quite a lot. We have 10 of those, followed by denial of service, which is an attack meant to shut down the machine, making it accessible. Information disclosure vulnerability, with 4 of those. That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. And some of the worst kinds of updates for those particular bugs is memory leaking. So if you have a particular server that is memory leaking passwords or confidential data, that can be very, very serious. And lastly, security feature bypass. That's when an attacker bypasses the authentication mechanisms to gain access to a device. So if these are the second tier questions that you need to ask when deciding on a patching strategy, what might be the first? Well, we call these our 6-factor approach. Now, there are 6 factors that we believe you should be using to prioritize any patch for deployment in either the first ring or second ring, potentially even 3, to your highly distributed environment to keep your environment safe. Of course, the more updates you deploy, the larger the payload, but also the more reboots that might be needed in order to install all of those updates. So phasing them over a couple of weeks might be really important. Now, to make the decision easy, we're going to use the vendor severity. Now, the vendor severity usually runs from critical, high, medium, low. There's a couple of differences for some of the third parties. Some of them call them moderate or important, but usually in that order, you have a vendor's decision about the severity of that vulnerability that is fixed. And then we have the CVSS score. The CVSS score is an independent score, is out of 10, and it has a special calculator. That calculator is version 4.0 right now. And into that calculator, they can place things like the complexity that is required to exploit the vulnerability, but also the kind of damage that can be caused if you exploit it. And they put all that data into this calculator and they get a score out of 10, 10 being the very worst and 0 being the very least. Now, if you combine the two together, you now have somewhat of a better decision about the severity of a vulnerability that might make an update more urgent than another. But then we look at the actual vulnerability itself, and we have 2 states that can help us add to that selection criteria. First one being weaponized. Now, weaponized means that through our partnership with our antivirus organizations, we have been told that they can tell this particular CVE has been used to launch a sophisticated virus attack or ransomware attack. And when there's evidence of that happening, it is placed into a database, which we then update inside of Syxsense. That allows you to see if an attack is happening, but it doesn't necessarily change the vendor severity or CVSS score, because those vendors don't necessarily track the weaponization. So in that scenario, we'd like to add weaponization to the selection that you're using for prioritizing the patches that will solve vulnerabilities in your organization. Public aware, on the other hand, does not mean that I'm telling you on this webcast that there is a patch to solve a vulnerability. It is where potentially a white hat hacker or an honorable hacker, sometimes they're called, has detected a specific exploit, and they go to the vendor and they say, this is how I've been able to exploit your software. Please provide a patch within 30 days or I'll publish that to the internet. Now, if the vendor looks at the precise blueprint that is documented about how to exploit it, and it's really difficult to do, they might decide not to release a patch for it. And at which point that ethical hacker could potentially release the information to the internet or to the YouTube. If that happens, and we learn about it, we put an extra flag in Syxsense called public aware. And that just gives you an awareness that someone is able to exactly follow those steps to exploit your vulnerability. I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that knew that something on the internet could show how to exploit a vulnerability and I didn't take steps to resolve it, especially if I'm using that tiered approach, ring 1, ring 2, ring 3 to deploy my updates. Now we're going to balance everything with a countermeasure. So a countermeasure is where you may have a next generation antivirus or a firewall, potentially security in your environment, or potentially a group policy change can mitigate the need to roll out that update. So in that scenario where you've got priorities, you might want to put a vulnerability that has a countermeasure, deploy the countermeasure. That gives you time to roll out the other serious patches that solve the vulnerabilities, and then you can roll out the next set of patches to solve those vulnerabilities. Do be aware to look at the vendor's recommendations. If you have applied countermeasures and those vulnerabilities are now solved by a patch, do you need to reverse the countermeasure? Do make sure you do check that. You obviously are aware that a lot of countermeasures are registry keys. You don't want to leave registry keys on your systems if they're not used for something, actually as a future exploit. And then lastly, your exposure. So if you combine everything together with your exposure, you can make an informed decision about what patches you're deploying first to, obviously, in an example, if you had a critical severity vulnerability that was public aware on just 5% of your environment, that might be less important than a medium severity vulnerability that is on 95% of your environment. So in that scenario, you're making an informed decision. That update is important to me. The risk is greater. So you can decide and have all the information available to prioritize your Patch Tuesday. Of course, if you're able to, deploy everything, but not everyone is able to, and it's not convenient for lots of customers of ours that are in finance, where we require so many reboots and the users get pretty upset with countless reboots, one after the other. In that scenario, we can use that ring approach and help to deploy faster to remove the risks much quicker. Okay, so what we're going to do now is to look at the analysis of Patch Tuesday. Now, what we do have on our website that we release every single Patch Tuesday is our recommendations. So if you pop across to syxsense.com, you'll find that the new website has been updated. It looks absolutely fantastic. Up here on the resources section, you'll find all of the news and events that we're releasing from Syxsense. You'll see all of the other webinars that we release throughout the month, not just for Patch Tuesday, but we've got third parties, vulnerability remediation as well. All of these webinars are free to join, and we'd love you to join us to learn how to protect your environment. But we also have the Patch Tuesday links, and there you'll find on the Tuesday of Patch Tuesday, we will release our recommendations. So as I said, we had 72 fixes, 5 critical, 2 have been weaponized, and we have updates for Windows, components, Office, SQL Server, Hypervisor, .NET Framework. They've all been fixed this month, with some very, very serious ones I'm going to talk about in a second. Now, as I said before, February is back to its usual number, so we have quite a lot to talk about. But what is interesting is when you count all of the updates that were fixed by Microsoft and you take all of the CVSS scores and you count them up, of course, because we had lots more vulnerabilities fixed this month, the number is a lot larger. But the average number of CVSS score is 7.7. Remember, the CVSS score is out of 10, which means that a huge majority of the fixes in this Patch Tuesday release are solving a much higher severity risk to your organization. Last month, it was only 7.0. So we are kind of needing to be very economical in the selection of updates if we are going to use those things that we talked about earlier to prioritize. Starting with number 1, CVE 2024, and there's actually a trend actually with the first two. 2024 21412, which is Internet Shortcut Files Security Bypass. Now, an improper input validation when handling Internet shortcut files, a remote attacker can trick a victim into clicking a specifically crafted shortcut file and execute code on the system. Now, this is currently targeting Forex traders to gain remote access, and they're basically putting these links into forums. So you have a web forum, such as an online marketplace, and that link can launch this particular weaponization. So it has a vendor severity of important, CVSS score of 8.1. Its risk is attack vector network, which means it can be exploited over any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, but luckily user interaction is required. So if your users are trained not to click links, not to open up something they're not expecting to get, like an email, then you are somewhat protected. However, given the fact that this is weaponized, I would highly recommend this be one of the updates you put in your first deployment. My second recommendation is CVE 2024-21351. Now, this is the Windows Smart Screen Security Feature Bypass vulnerability. Now, any IT admins from maybe 5-10 years ago will know that there was a tool called Streams, and what Streams allowed you to do was to track where a file was downloaded from, called Mark of the Web. Mark of the Web means that you've downloaded this file originally from somewhere which may be unsafe. And what Windows is doing is looking at the Mark of the Web identifier, and it's going to warn the user if that file has come from an unsafe source. So you may have downloaded it from the internet, and when you are double clicking the file, so you're downloading a new version of software, Adobe Reader, for example, and you've downloaded it from the internet, potentially it's going to warn you. It's going to say, hey, this file has come from an unsafe source. Well, this particular vulnerability bypasses that. So you can actually get a file that has come from an unsafe source, a user can run it, and it can launch without the Smart Screen security feature, validating that the file is unsafe and allowing the user simply to launch it without any extra user interaction. This is very serious, especially if you are downloading and using files across your network, especially IT admins who are accessing shared drives to install software. If you're using Syxsense, then obviously we recommend you upload all of your software to the cloud storage and deploy the software that way. And this will actually bypass that issue completely. This particular vulnerability is moderate in severity by the vendor with a CVSS of 7.6. Just goes to show a weaponized vulnerability doesn't necessarily increase the severity that a vendor is allocating to the patch itself. Its attack vector is network, which means any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges. Luckily, we do require the user to run something in order to exploit it. So I would highly recommend that be the second update in your deployment this month. And thirdly, the last incredibly serious one, it is there is actually 2 updates that were released today with a 9.8 of a CVSS score. It's the highest in this release. It's luckily not weaponized. which is the CVE 2024-21413, which is the Microsoft Outlook remote code execution vulnerability. Now, similar to the other two, there is a Microsoft protection view that will actually validate an email to look for something inside of it to make sure that the user's not going to look or launch something from the email unexpectedly. Okay, that's called the protected view. Well, this particular vulnerability allows the exploit to bypass that protected view. So you probably are the same as me. We've got Outlook open and we have a preview pane. So we have the email, we click the email, we don't open the email, we just simply look at the preview pane to decide whether we delete it, forward it on to our security department because it's some spam, or whether we reply to the user because we know what the email is about and we're expecting it. That preview pane is an attack vector in this scenario. So simply looking at the email, if there was a sophisticated link that launched something inside that email, then looking at the preview pane is an attack vector. It's incredibly serious. Of all the customers that are using Outlook, I would highly recommend that this be deployed urgently, and it's my third recommendation for this week. It is critical vendor severity. Its attack vector is across any network, including the internet, with low attack complexity, no privileges, no user interaction. Luckily, none of the updates I've recommended today have a jump point, which is fantastic. However, still, they are incredibly important to deploy. As I mentioned, we have all of the vulnerabilities from Patch Tuesday listed in this little list down here. If you're not a Syxsense customer, just go ahead and take the CVE reference from here, pop it into the toolset you're using in this order, and any of the vulnerabilities that you are finding in your environment that is missing on the most of your devices, so the exposure is really high, go ahead and pop that into a deployment. One more thing, a couple of things. The additional details column here is filled with all additional information about what we have found about the vulnerability. If you do go down this list and you see something like the jump point, for example, this one is Azure Kubernetes. This one does have a jump point, and we explain how the vulnerability can move from one to another. All the data is here on our website. We do hope that this was incredibly useful. If you find any particular articles that you would like us to discuss and digest on these webinars, we love doing that, especially for weaponization that has happened more recently. And until next time, I hope this was really useful. I look forward to seeing you back here in March. Until next time, happy patching.